Oh, thank you, Jenny, and good morning, everybody. Really delighted to be here with you. I got to get my Yeti cups because we're going to have some fun. Glad to have the opportunity to talk about soybean maturity groups and planting dates with you this morning. You likely know if you've been following the soybean extension program, we've been doing a lot of work in this area over the past few years. And I want to go into some fundamentals of this work today because the soybean schools are really all about giving us enough time to deep dive into certain production topics. And the ones we're going to focus on today is soybean planting date and soybean maturity group. So the objectives for this presentation are, again, to deep dive into both of those production practices and then highlight a grower decision support tool that will be released later this spring to help you make data-driven decisions on those production practices. So before we start, I'm going to talk about some of the production practices that have a relationship with high-yielding soybeans. Dr. Sean Conley, the keynote speaker for this soybean school, will also talk on these topics. And based on what we know in North Carolina over the past few years, what production practices that we can control have the largest impact on high-yielding soybeans? Okay, planting date, maturity group, and there was one more. I can make a comment about row width. That wasn't one that emerged as a strong predictor in this analysis. Yeah, foliar fungicide use. So those were the three that we've seen consistently be related to high-yielding soybeans. And we know this because we looked at 900 entries into the NC Soybean Yield Contest over an 18-year period to see the production practices that growers control, which have the largest impact on soybean yield. You'll see I don't have any handouts in your booklet. That's because I want to push you to the NC State Soybean Extension portal. And there's several QR codes throughout this presentation you can use to get there. Otherwise, you just need to Google NC State soybeans. All the information's available there. But the point is, in that analysis where we looked at high-yielding soybeans from those yield contest entries, two of the topics that we're going to talk about today were at the top: planting date and maturity group. So let's first start talking about soybean planting date. If you look across all the ag news across the U.S., they're talking about planting soybeans earlier and the relationship with high yield. You can look in the upper Midwest, our region, Mid-South. This is a major topic in relationship with soybean production. Why? Why is the interest? Well, if you look at data, this is out of Sean Conley's program, who you'll hear from in a little bit. They found, looking at data from all across the U.S., if you were planting 12 days earlier, it would have resulted in a 10% greater yield. In the Southeast, we could be looking at our average soybean planting dates, which for North Carolina are in late May, and push that planting date up 30 days earlier to realize some of those yield increases. So we know there's this interest in early planting, and a lot of farmers in the state want to try to plant their soybeans earlier than historically done to try to capitalize on some of the yield benefits. If you look across the U.S., this is a map that our National Science for Success team put together. There's different yield implications for delays in planting. This shows the yield implications of delaying planting from May 1 to May 31. So for us in North Carolina, that might be a 4% yield loss on average, so not as large as you might see in Illinois, where if you delayed planting that much, you'd see a 15% yield loss. So lots of interest in early planting. That's one of the reasons that we've utilized a lot of the data that I'll talk about today to help move the replant coverage period earlier for soybeans planted in North Carolina. Previously, it was April 21st for your part of the state, April 15 for the Blacklands. Now you can plant on April 1st to try to drive up yield if you were looking at all this interest across the U.S. But we're going to really talk about today, you can plant on April 1st now and have replant coverage from the federal government. But should you be planting that early? Let's talk about some of the data. So why are we interested in planting early? Obviously, we saw there's a lot of ag news. There's data to back up the implications on yield. But what are we really trying to do? Can't say I'm the one that coined the term lapped. Who's this graph from? Dr. Dunphy. So he would famously talk about you got to get your soybeans tall enough to lap the middles. When you go around the U.S., people are like, we don't know what you're talking about, lap the middles. But basically get to canopy closure. So look here, you've planted early, you've planted later. You're going to be at maximum yield potential if you've gotten beans tall enough to lap the middles. And essentially you're trying to build the factory to drive vegetative growth, which will ultimately drive reproductive development. If you look just on average, soybeans add one new node every 3.7 days after the first trifoliate appears, so V1 up to reproductive development. So if you looked on a macro level, the earlier you plant, the more nodes you should be accumulating. This is data from across the US, not necessarily North Carolina. And another reason there's a lot of interest is not only to drive more vegetative growth, but I will just say the breeders in other parts of the US are really positioning soybeans and new genetics to be bred to perform well in a early planting situation. So there's breeding efforts focused in this space as well. I want to look at a little data to think about the vegetative factory and how that actually drives yield. So this is data from North Carolina over the past 5 years. If you look on the x-axis, it's plant height in inches. If you look on the y-axis, it's yield. So there is a positive relationship between plant height and yield about to 36 inches, which is right around where Dr. Dunphy said you wanted to be, about 3 feet tall. At which point, the relationship between plant height and yield becomes pretty flat. And even at really high plant heights, there's a trend towards declining yield. So yes, you do need the vegetation to drive growth, but only up to a certain point. So I'm sure many of you have seen before some of your tallest beans aren't the highest yielding. And this is why. This is about the cutoff here for the height you need to be at maximum yield potential. So looking at that, the relationship between height and yield, let's look at the relationship between planting date and yield. This is data that's been collected across North Carolina for the past 5 years. I'm going to orient you to the graph. First of all, we have different colored dots for the different regions. We'll look just at the Piedmont next, but this is all across the state. We've got planting date on the x-axis. We had planting dates from March 13th all the way out through early August. Yield on the y-axis. And you look all across the state, the single planting date that maximized yield was May 1st. How many of y'all could have just guessed that before we went into this research? Okay, quite a few. What surprises you on this graph?
There's outliers all over the world.
Okay, well, potentially some of that's the different regions. When you look in the ag media about soybean planting date and yield, what does it say? We kind of talked about this a few slides ago.
Earlier planting, higher yield.
Earlier planting, higher yields. Is that what y'all see on this graph? No. So let's talk a little bit about this for North Carolina. I think if you looked in the ag media, you would have expected to see this linear decline in yield as planting date is delayed. But we found over 5 years, many regions, many sites across North Carolina, that we actually have some negative yield implications of planting too early in our state. And we are going to explore some of those. Now, there's areas where you can plant early and have less yield implications. Those are generally out in the blacklands. And there's a variety of reasons for that. So if we were to look at this graph just for the Piedmont, I want y'all to guess what the date that maximized yield was for the Piedmont. And whoever, just to get things interactive, whoever can guess that date will give a Yeti. And you can pick which color. All right, hands flying up. May 12th, bingo. So if you, so again, this was for the state. If you looked at the Piedmont, here's the graph for the Piedmont. I'll tell you that is because the optimal planting date in the Blacklands is around April 20. It's a little bit later in other parts of the state. This is looking at the whole Piedmont. I know there's a lot of variability across the Piedmont. We're going to get to how you could make these predictions for your specific location in the Piedmont. But just like across the state, in the Piedmont, there's also some risks of early planting, which we'll define as before mid-April. And want to spend some time in this talking about those risks. So what are some risks to early planting? Frost. Quality, stand, seedling disease. Deer is a big one. How many of y'all saw heavy deer pressure in your early planted beans this year? Okay, all the beans. Anything else? All right, what was that? Test weight. Let's talk about some of the risks to early planting. First of all, the first one that was thrown off was plant death due to freeze or frost. And that can happen, and I'm glad we have the Wisconsin soybean specialist in here because he probably encounters soybeans and plant death due to freeze or frost more often than we do. But I do want to say, while this is a risk, it's a risk that we rarely realize in early planted soybeans in North Carolina. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Cool soils, which someone mentioned, can synergize other issues. Wes is in the back. We've seen plant early, slow metabolism of the herbicide when the soils are cool. That can synergize herbicide injury, for example. Early season pathogens, somebody talked about that. That's why our recommendation now, based on updated research, is you have to have a fungicidal seed treatment on the seed when you're planting before mid-May to protect against early season pathogens. We can see some strange things with early season insect pressure. This can be managed, but you have to scout early in the season, which not everybody does. We've seen things like kudzu bug pressure in beans planted before mid-April that you need to make an insecticide application for, or heavy bean leaf beetle pressure. So there's insect pressure, there's deer pressure issues generally that are worse in early planted beans. One of the biggest challenges that we're going to talk about is related to what Jenny just shared with you, in that in our earliest planted beans, we often have less vegetative growth than our beans planted in late April and to late May, which is counterintuitive to what you'd think. You think the earlier you plant, the more vegetative growth you're going to get, the higher yields you're going to get. But now, for 5 years in a row, we haven't seen that at all of our sites, really. We're going to talk a little bit about that because I think that's one of the biggest risks to early planting in our environment. And then someone mentioned this, but problems on the back end of the season are a big risk to planting early maturing varieties before early May in our environment. And we have some data on that. So what temperatures can really kill a soybean early in the season? Okay, fantastic. 28 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 or more hours. We pretty rarely encounter that in North Carolina, even in our early planting situations from late March to mid-April. But we can encounter it. But one thing that's important to note is beans are pretty resilient. They're very susceptible to cold injury when the hypocotyl arch is about to pull the cotyledons out of the soil surface. Okay, they can get killed there. Or when the new growth is emerging from the cotyledons. But what can happen if cold kills the new growth here? What will the soybean do? Okay, if the cold injury kills the new growth here, but the cotyledonary node stays intact, what will the soybean plant do? Regrow, okay? So that's one of the reasons soybeans are resilient and why we recommend that after you have some cold injury, you wait 3 to 5 days to assess whether you need to replant. In all our early planting research over the past 5 years, we've only seen measurable loss from cold injury at one site. That was Greg Moxley's site in Yadkin County, where we lost about 30% of the stand due to cold conditions. And we get out there and count the plants. At a few sites, we've seen some cold injury like bleaching. It's been cosmetic. But for the vast majority of our early planting situations, this hasn't been a risk that we have encountered. If you want to see what some of the early season issues are going on across North Carolina, we have a tool available now. This was funded by the NC Soybean Producers Association and the NC Ag Foundation at NC State to track the issues that are emerging in soybean production across the state, called Beans Gone Wild. Has anybody used it? All right, a few folks. So this was our pilot year for Beans Gone Wild. We were trying to figure it out, see if we could do it really well. And next year, we're going to have a parallel social media effort and try to make some more updates as the map is updated with issues emerging across the field. But if you've planted your beans, let's say first week of April, and you see something strange, you could come onto this map, Beans Gone Wild and search and see what some of the issues that other folks are seeing, because you might be seeing those in your early planted beans as well. I'll show one example here from Iredell County. I'm assuming Laura and Jenny uploaded this for Beans Gone Wild. This is three-cornered alfalfa hopper injury. We can often see this following a cover crop with a lot of different species in it, which your panel can discuss that later. But this was an issue saw in relatively early planted beans. This was scouted May 12th. You can see the beans are somewhat large at this point, and so that means that these were early planted beans. And so you might be seeing a similar issue on your farm in your early planted beans. This would be a good resource to see what some of those early season pest pressure dynamics you might see are looking like in early planted beans. So early season insect pressure, deer pressure, those are a risk. This is a risk that I really want to spend a lot of time talking about. This photo is from Sampson County, but we could have pulled it out of a Piedmont site. The trend's generally been the same, and I'll show you some data from the Piedmont in a minute. So on the x-axis here, these are planting dates. They're usually in the middle of the month, sometime in March, April, May, June, July. I think a lot of us would expect that these March planted beans would actually be the tallest, but they're not, and we've seen this for 5 years. So considering what Jenny just shared with you, why do you think this is the case? Okay, it does have something to do with night length. Okay, low temperature has something to do with both of those. So what we've now seen very consistently again the past 5 years is our earliest planted beans, they're usually planted third week of March. They can be flowering by the first or second week of May. The plant has the night length it needs before the summer solstice as well to trigger reproductive development. But these beans haven't had the temperatures to drive vegetative growth like an April or May planted bean. And even if they're an indeterminate variety, when they're flowering that early, first or second week of May, they could never overcome that lack of vegetative growth. And that's one of the big reasons that we're seeing a yield drag on really early planted beans in North Carolina. The first year I saw it, I thought, no, this isn't right. This is a mistake. Second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, you see it for 5 years all across the state. This is a phenomenon we often see in our earliest planted beans. You can see they're even shorter than our double crop beans planted in the middle of June. And that's one of the things that's pulling down yield really early in the season. Here's some data on same thing. Piedmont, this is a Union County site we had in 2023. On the x-axis, planting dates in a number. I know it should be in a date, but it's in a number. This is mid-March through early August. Each of these lines is a different maturity group. And basically what I want you to see is all the lines look the same, which means the phenomenon is the same across all the maturity groups. And we've got determinate growth habit in there. We got indeterminate growth habit in there. Trend's always the same. Plant heights on the y-axis, and look, our earliest planted beans are often, maybe just as tall as our double crop beans, and our May and June planted beans are taller. And so our May and April planted beans are taller. This is one of the reasons we're seeing yield drag early in the with early planting dates, let's say before mid-April in our environment. I spent a lot of time talking about the risks of early planting. If you look at that curve, we've got this what we call quadratic curve. Yields lower when you plant early, yields lower when you plant too late. What's the risk of planting too late? Okay, drought conditions, which really can be encountered at lots of points in soybean production in our state, but other ideas?
Beans can't make it before frost.
Okay. The beans can't make it before frost. I mean, that is a risk to late planting if you're using a late maturity group, especially, closer to the Virginia border. Other risks to late planting? Yeah, so they start flowering quickly after planting, and then they don't essentially get enough vegetative growth to drive yield. We can't get to that 36-inch point. So that's one of the biggest risks to late planting. So we talked about some risks to early planting. We talked about some risks to late planting. If you had to define the optimum planting period in North Carolina, Dr. Dunphy previously had it defined as May 1 to June 10, which was probably very appropriate for when, he was here. But now we've got newer genetics. Growers are managing beans more aggressively. If you look at our data now, the optimum planting period is somewhere between April 20 and May 30. And it depends where you're at in the state. And we're going to highlight the tool that will help you make decisions on that. But first, that was a deep dive into planting date. We're going to do a deep dive into maturity group, and then we'll highlight the tool which explores the interactions between the two. Our national group of agronomists who do work on a variety of things published a fact sheet on soybean planting date, and you can get some more details from that fact sheet if you want to dive deeper to any of the topics we just covered. So we can talk about soybean maturity group. Jenny did a great introduction to this, which is very nice, but just to re-emphasize, there's these latitudinal zones. To say where a soybean genetic package best fits, that's largely based on latitude. We know temperature drives this as well. But in the lower maturity groups that they grow in the upper Midwest, they'll flower with a shorter length of night. Whereas the later maturity groups flower with a longer length of night. And again, the reason that we can grow all of these somewhat successfully in North Carolina is because we have the length of night throughout the season to get things rolling from a flowering standpoint. So we grow maturity groups 2 through 8 in North Carolina. Probably in this part of the state, it's mostly 4 through 7. But for a variety of reasons, we're growing maturity groups 2 through 8. What influences your maturity group selection? Yield potential? Okay, planting date?
Harvest date.
Harvest date, that's a great one. Rotational complexity, okay, these are some fantastic things. So what's your soybean planting date? What's your rotational complexity? Desired variety source, I just throw that up there because as you know, let's say you're producing for the non-GMO or organic markets, that kind of narrows off in what your maturity group availability is in our area. Yield potential is a big one, and I would emphasize, I think one of the reasons that soybean production is resilient in North Carolina year in, year out is because we plant a diversity of maturity groups at a diversity of planting dates, which will continue to be an important production practice. But let's talk a little bit about each of these. So in that same yield contest analysis I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, where we looked at all these production practices that influence high yield, the single production practice that influenced high yield was using an earlier maturing variety. So in that analysis, maturity group 4 or earlier averaged 73 bushels per acre. That was 54% of the entries, so essentially half the entries. 5, 6s, and 7s, they averaged 55 bushels per acre. That's a big difference. Maturity group was the primary driver of high yield in this analysis. That was for the state. If you looked at the Piedmont, so this area, you see a very similar thing. Maturity group 4 or earlier averaged 80 bushels per acre. Maturity group later than a 4 averaged 61 bushels per acre. So we know that there's high yield potential associated with using the earlier maturing varieties. Here you can look at that in a different way. Same yield contest analysis. Here's the maturity groups on the x-axis, yields on the y. As maturity group increased, yield declined. I want to talk to you about why is this the case? Why do earlier maturing varieties maximize yield in good conditions? Sunlight and the relationship with flowering. Okay, other ideas? Okay, so the earlier maturing varieties are often indeterminate. So I'm just going to take a second to talk about this. So historically, the earlier maturing varieties, 2s, 3s, 4s, have always been indeterminate, which means that when the plant starts flowering, it continues to grow vegetatively on the main stem, which means the reproductive development is generally a little bit longer. You get some more vegetative growth. Theoretically, you'd think that would increase yield. The later maturing varieties, 5s, 6s, and 7s, have historically been determinate, where once the plant starts flowering, really stops vegetative growth on the main stem. The landscape is becoming more complex. So how many of y'all grew an indeterminate 5 this year? How many of you grew an indeterminate late 5? All right, a couple of folks. So yes, a lot of the yield advantage of an earlier maturing variety has historically been attributed to its growth habit, it being indeterminate. But I do just want to say we've done some research both in my program and Dr. Dominic Reising's program, who's one of your row crop entomologists over the past few years, looking at indeterminate and determinate varieties in the same maturity, relative maturity. So like a indeterminate 5.2 versus a determinate 5.2. Indeterminate 5.9 versus a determinate 5.9. This is work funded by the Soybean Producers Association. When we're looking at the two growth habits within the same relative maturity, which one do you think yields the highest, or does one yield the highest? Rarely a difference between the indeterminate and determinate growth habits when we're in the same relative maturity group. We need to do more research on this. There's very few production areas in the United States where you have to be thinking about the two different types of growth habit. 20 years ago, it was the Mid-South before they shifted almost all their acres to indeterminates. Now we're thinking about it a little bit, especially as more indeterminate varieties that are later maturing come on the market. But I want us to be cautious in thinking that the yield advantage is because of the indeterminate growth habit itself, because we've rarely been able to document that in research in the Mid-South or in North Carolina. But yes, I often think it is, people say it's because they're indeterminate. But here's what I think one of the major drivers is. So genetic gain is the progress that breeders make every year on making the genetics better. It's independent of management. It's independent of weather. It's just what the breeders are doing every year with the genetics. We're going to look at genetic gain here. The breeders, the public breeders, the private breeders, they came together, they wrote some papers about what the genetic gain is across the maturity groups. Here, we got maturity group 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What progress are the breeders making every year in the genetics? If you look at the 2s and 3s, the breeders every year are making 0.34 bushels per acre per year progress in the maturity group 2 and 3s. They're making 0.15 bushels per acre per year in the maturity group 7s. One of the major reasons that we see early maturing varieties yield higher in optimum production situations is the genetics are just better. There's more breeding efforts. The genetic gain is greater in the early maturing varieties. And those breeders specifically are breeding earlier maturing varieties to have better branching ability, put more pods on the branches, and ability to compensate at low population. So if you look at our yield contest entries every year, it's often an early 4 planted at 80,000 seeds per acre, which is much lower than is going to get you optimum yield in most production situations. But those genetics are being bred to perform optimally at low population. So when we think about, okay, why is an early maturing variety doing well in high yielding situations in our circumstances? I think it has a lot more to do with genetic gain than it does with growth habit specifically.
Do you spread your risk growing indeterminates or the weather over determinate?
Yeah, it's a great question. So do you spread your risk by growing more indeterminates than determinates? So first of all, one of the things I think it's important to emphasize about soybean is the whole species is way more indeterminate than corn, for example. And so a determinate soybean variety will flower for how many weeks? Just throw something out there. 3 to 5 weeks. An indeterminate variety will maybe flower for 4 to 6 weeks in our environment. So regardless of the growth habit, by growing soybeans, you are mitigating your risk against weather at some level by spreading out the flowering period. We have planted these indeterminate and determinate varieties in the same relative maturity across a lot of different planting situations where we're encountering stress. Never under irrigation is our research typically. And we still are rarely seeing an advantage of the indeterminate over the determinate when they're in the same relative maturity, even under stressful conditions. One area we'd like to expand our work is most of the work we've been doing comparing the two growth habits has been in full season planting situations. So, third week of April through the middle of May. We are going to do more research starting this year looking at June planting dates and then into early July planting dates and how those growth habits influence yield and stability in the later planting situations where you do need a little bit more vegetative growth. But I don't think we have data to say here today, like, yeah, you should plant an indeterminate variety to mitigate risk, because we are planting under a variety of stressful conditions and rarely seeing that affect yield. Yes. Yeah, so that's a very good question. So how are you choosing the varieties that you're comparing with the two different growth habits? So a lot of this work has been done out of Dominic Reising's program, where we're trying to look at, do we need to adjust corn earworm thresholds differently between determinate and indeterminate varieties? And that work, we were working with one company, so you're trying to narrow the genetic base, to get one variety that was determinate and one variety that was indeterminate. Is it perfect, even if you're working with the same company? No. But we were doing that across a couple different relative maturity group pairs. So like a 5.2, 5.4, 5.9, to try to get some different varieties where we were evaluating it. It's not just one data point. Recognizing, that's a little bit of a limitation, we have subsequently expanded our work in that area to have 10 to, well, hopefully this year we'll have more like 15 varieties within a maturity group 5, some with determinate, some with indeterminate. So you're starting to make the conclusion across a broader set of varieties. In a perfect situation, we'd have a plant breeder make what they call an ISO line, where you have the exact same genetics, one with determinate, one with indeterminate, but haven't found anybody to make those for us yet. So I think there are some limitations. I think we're kind of fixing that with some of our subsequent research. I think that's a great point. I think what we've seen so far is generally there's limited effect, but there are circumstances where there is an effect. So for example, in this year in Hyde County, we saw the indeterminates out-yield the determinates. That's in the Blacklands. You probably know. You probably duck hunt out there. Whereas in Sampson County in the Coastal Plain, the determinates out-yielded the indeterminates. So there is something about the season or about the soil type or about the environment that I think can influence it sometimes. I would say 80% of the time we see no effect. Sometimes we see a little bit. And I think we need to explore that a little bit more. And I will say, just on some research that we've seen ourselves, is there's definitely circumstances where an indeterminate variety is not a good fit in full season planting situations. So we planted a specific indeterminate 5, later 5 this year in the last week of April, and it was pretty much a disaster at most of our sites. So there's going to be certain circumstances where it's not a good fit. Now that we're on this topic, I thought I'd do my talk next year on determinate and indeterminate varieties, but we're just getting into it today. One thing we saw is more green stem in the indeterminate than the determinate varieties. That was in 1 year, but something we're definitely interested in exploring more, and that could be genetics, or it could be a combination of the genetics and the growth habits. So doing more research in that area. All right, I'm going to move on. I just want to quickly mention, when we talk about maturity groups, it can all sound really good. Higher yield potential, better genetics, often a pretty good premium for early delivery in August and September. But there are also risks, which many of y'all know about, which are these seed quality issues on the back end of the season. We knew about these from the Mid-South, because this is an issue that they encountered when they shifted to the early production systems. This is not a surprise to anybody. I would say we do see this less frequently in the Piedmont than in the Coastal Plain and the Blacklands, but it can still happen. And so then really the question becomes, can you do anything about it? So every time our little research combine gets a yield from a plot, we catch a little envelope of seed. And then in that envelope, we quantify the seed damage the same way it's done when y'all take your beans to the elevator. We were trained by the same people that grade your beans. And so what we'll do is we'll take the full sample. This is obviously, a problematic example. There's seed quality issues. We take out the seed that has damage. We take out the seed that has purple seed stain, which is quantified differently at the elevator. You likely know that, but some of our buyers aren't too concerned about the purple seed stain part. And then we have a clean sample. So we're quantifying how much damage is there really across a lot of production practices, including growth habit. But in this case, we're talking about maturity group. This is a busy slide, so you just listen to what I say. We've consistently seen in all our planting date research, if you're growing a maturity group 2 through 4, so the earlier maturing varieties that have better genetics and higher yield potential in good situations, there's seed quality risk when you're planting before mid-May. A lot of you could have predicted that going into this research, but that's what we're seeing. The question is, can you do anything about that? So the NC Soybean Producers Association and a lot of growers across the state, particularly this was driven out of the Blacklands, wanted to know, can we help manage those seed quality issues? If we planted a late 3, really trying to push our yields in a great field, can you manage those seed quality issues on the back end of the season? So we looked at a variety of pest management regimes. I'll orient you here. The red lines are damaged. So remember, we quantify damaged seed and purple seed stain differently. The blue lines are purple seed stain. This is the percentage of damage on the y-axis. Okay, this is in 6 locations with 3 planting dates within each location, with 3 maturity groups within each planting date over 2 years. This is a lot of data, a lot. And 2 of these sites were out of the Piedmont. And in each site, we had 3 planting dates and 3 maturity groups. So that's 9 combinations where we're trying to create seed quality issues because essentially the weather hit at the right time. And within each of those, we looked at some different pest management regimes. One was just uncontrolled, doing nothing. One was looking at a fungicide alone at R3, which might be common production practices for a few of the growers in here. One was an insecticide alone at R3. One was 2 fungicide applications. When we went into this research, we were getting a lot of questions about multiple fungicide applications to try to protect seed quality. And one was a fungicide and insecticide at R3 and R5. So right here, you're getting pretty aggressive mid-season pest management to look at the impact on seed quality. All right, so if we look at seed damage across all those pest management regimes, they did not affect seed damage. No effect of that aggressive mid-season pest management. Purple seed stain, we dropped it a little bit with 2 fungicide applications by about a percentage point, but practically that's not going to justify the cost. So can you manage the seed quality issues if you're growing an earlier maturing variety trying to push yield? Largely the answer is no. It's temperature and weather that is driving this, so that's going to be a risk associated with using an earlier maturing variety that needs to be considered. Now, if you looked at the impact of these strategies on yield, these would increase yield. We've seen 2 fungicide applications consistently increase yield that would return an ROI, but we're not talking about yield, we're talking about seed quality. And the question that drove the research is, can you manage the seed quality issues through aggressive mid-season pest management? No, and not to a level that matters from a seed quality perspective. All right, so we deep dived into planting date, some of the risks associated with planting date. We deep dived into maturity group and some of the risks associated with maturity group. So now we're going to shift into how do you make decisions about these production practices? Okay, we got experience. It's something about the information you have, and maybe I wanted to miss the first part.
Make the best guess you can.
Okay, best guess. Anybody else?
Start planting beans immediately when you finish corn.
Oh, start planting beans immediately when you finish planting corn. What about before? Or at the same time? I'm just giving you a hard time. Many of you know over the past 5 years, we've been looking at all these core agronomic production practices and research plots all across the state. Mostly we've looked at the impact on yield and seed quality, what we just talked about. But just so you know, we also look at the impact on things like protein and oil, which will become increasingly important in the future. And we've done this at 20 sites across the state over the past 5 years. So it's generated a large data set to help you make decisions about these production practices. I want to just shout out that many farmers across the state and extension agents have helped make this research a success. Tim Hambrick and Greg Moxley, who were hosted this research the first year and then a couple years later. In the first year, it was kind of wild. Then we got our feet under us, and there's just a lot of individuals that have helped create this data set. It was a big teamwork and funded by the NC Soybean Producers Association. So this is how we've been presenting the data in the past. And I hope when we have a better way, y'all will forgive me for this, but you can see it's complex. And this is the data combined over 20 sites, so no regionality. This is just looking at all these different maturity groups and the potential planting dates you could use and the different seeding rates and the impact on yield. And there's lots of interactions, which means the lines are all crossing. And we knew there had to be a better way to make this data usable on your operations. And so that's where we're at right now. We got some funding from the NC Plant Sciences Initiative and the NC Data Science Academy. The Plant Sciences Initiative is all about leveraging expertise from all across the university to work on agriculture. Through that, we got engaged with a graduate student who's in computer engineering, so College of Engineering. He's never worked on ag before. He did like machine learning from Amazon before this project. His name is Sams Roy, and he is developing with a team of individuals a grower decision support tool to help you make decisions with this data in a more meaningful way. And where we're at with this tool, we beta tested it, which means it's kind of in the middle of development. We beta tested it with some growers, some in the room, John, Philip, to try to get some feedback, also with some extension agents like Jenny, on what we can do to make this tool better and more usable for farmers before public release. So we've done that beta testing. We've gotten a lot of feedback on how we can make the tool better for y'all, and that's what we're working on right now, is trying to incorporate that feedback. But I want to tell you kind of what the tool will do and how it will help you make decisions about the production practices we just talked about. So it won't exactly look like this, but we're working with SAS as an industry partner to develop this tool. And this is a platform that they have called the VIA platform. And essentially what you'll do is you'll go onto a map and you'll drop a pin on your location in North Carolina. And once you drop the pin, it'll tell you what your optimum planting window is at that location. Or and then you can filter down into what maturity group you should be using at that planting date. Or let's say you're going to plant double crop beans. You can just drop your pin, adjust your planting date. It'll tell you what the best maturity group to use is. And then once you have your planting date maturity group combination, it will tell you what seeding rate is economically best within that planting date maturity group combination. And so that's essentially the functionality of what the tool is going to do, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback on making it better. So before I came, I just dropped a pin on the map near Statesville, where we are today, to see what the optimum planting period for this area would be. And if you ran it out in the map, the optimum planting period within the top 3 bushels of the top was April 28th through May 26th for this area right here. So then we had our optimum planting window defined. Then I asked you, okay, what's the highest yielding relative maturity? So not like maturity group 5, maturity group 6, like relative maturity is like 2.6, 7.2 for that optimum planting period. And this is where the next Yeti comes in. So it's maturity group 2 through 8. What's the optimum relative maturity within that optimum planting date window? Okay, there it was, 5.1. I wanted to give it to you, Michael, but it's 5.1 right there. And a lot of the relative maturities perform very similarly to that, but that's what the power of this tool is going to be. You can use all the data that's been generated in the field and this crazy graph here, and use the tool to help you make better decisions, and then you can drill down into seeding rate as well. So look out for this tool later this spring. We're really excited to release it, and we have been beta testing with farmers to make sure there weren't bugs, but I do just want you all to know we'll be committed to improving it over the year as you're using it to make it the best that it can be. So the objectives for this presentation were to deep dive into planting date and maturity group and talk a little bit more about each of those than we generally have time in the presentation. I will take questions. And then highlight this grower decision support tool, which we hope to have available by April 1st. Now, I know that won't help you make maturity group or seed selections for this coming season, but it should help you be able to optimize planting date or seeding rate, and then we'll make improvements so it's fully functional for 2025. And with that, happy to take questions.
Can you use the tool in the reverse form? Can you pick your relative maturity first and then your planting date?
Yeah. Yeah, so the tool, and that's part of the great feedback we got from our beta testers here, that you needed to be able to manipulate kind of all of it. And so right now what we have is these sliders at the top where once you've dropped your location, you can just slide, like let's say you wanted to look at a 4.7 through a 5.4 and the effect on planting date. You just use the sliders to slide to whatever circumstance you want.
I want to go back to your genetic gain slide. Is there an expectation that the 4s and less will continue to be better than the 5s and above?
I would just say generally in what we know about where the soybean breeding efforts are being dedicated, yes, that's probably the case. Now I will say, you know, we have some interesting things going on with the later maturing varieties. For example, some South American companies bringing later maturing varieties into our environment. And so things like that might have some effect on the genetic gain. That was the genetic gain for U.S. soybean production. But I would, if I had to guess in my crystal ball, that the trend would likely stay the same.
Well, if that trend continues, will your tool, where will it continue to get yield data from over time?
Yeah. Very good question. Where will the tool continue to get yield data over time? When the beta testers brought this up right when we started beta testing, I about had a heart attack because you know what it takes to do these research trials. But in all reality, we will pull data from the OVT into the tool. And hopefully at some point, maybe we'll find an opportunity to pull grower data into the tool. So this is like the first iteration of the tool. We're going to have to make it better over time. But do acknowledge data will have to continually be fed to be relevant for our production situation.
What kind of planting depth do you use? Do you plant shallower if you plant earlier versus when it gets warmer, dry weather? Do you go a little deeper? Or do y'all plant consistent in your plots?
Good question. What about planting depth in our plot? So first of all, I have a very talented team of individuals that make a lot of the planting depth decisions, often in collaboration with the growers. So like when we started planting at Greg's, he would be in the field kind of helping us like this is the optimal planting depth for our situation because it's highly variable across the state. I will say when you're pulling a research planter all across the state and you're driving 4 hours to a site to plant, often you're going to plant in the depth that you can get your planter in the ground where you feel confident the beans will emerge, and it's a little bit variable each time you go to the field depending on residue levels and other things. So I wouldn't say we have a consistent depth. We try to lean on the growers and the extension agents who are like more active in that environment and what our research planner can do to make decisions about depth.
Done any research on whether row width affects production yield?
Okay, have you done any research on whether row width affects production and yield? So you probably remember Dr. Dunphy did a lot of work on row width in our environment, and often there was an advantage of a narrow row versus a wider row. But I do want to emphasize a lot of that research was conducted with late May and June planting dates, and we know the later you plant, the more important a narrow row becomes to try to get the leaf area that you need to drive yield. In more full season optimal planting situations, what we've seen, in that yield contest analysis where we looked at those 900 entries, we had entries from 7 inches all the way out to 40 inches. And row spacing did not impact yield in those high yielding situations. And I think the thing is, you know, in those high yielding situations, growers are using the right maturity group, they're using the right planting date, and they're often getting to canopy closure, and you have a lot more flexibility in those situations than when you do when you're planting in June. And Sean's done a lot of work like with producer-derived data on row width and can speak to that during his presentation.
Did you guys have a slide that had the correlation between early maturing beans and later in the season?
Did I have a slide that really showed that? Well, maybe not, but we do have that data. So the power of this data set is it's all across the planting dates that are used in North Carolina. So let's say you want to plant in June because you're planting behind wheat. You can go look at what maturity groups would be best. I will say one thing that's been very consistent in our data in the Piedmont, in the Coastal Plain, in the Blacklands, is that growers have a lot of flexibility with what maturity group they're using in a double crop situation. A lot more flexibility than historically has been thought. You know, people have historically thought the later you plant, the later maturing variety you should use. For us, we've seen 4s through 7s yield comparably in double crop situations. If you use a 2 or a 3, we've seen a yield drag. But a mid 4 to a 7, they've all generally been within a couple bushels per acre of one another in those late planting situations. And if you look at the OVT data, you pretty much see the same thing, that the maturity group effect on yield is minimized in late planting situations, as long as you're not planting anything too early.
What about pop-up with fertilizer?
What about the pop-up fertilizer? No, we have not done anything on that recently. Our soil fertility specialist, Dr. Luke Gataboni, has done some work on starter fertility, as well as some of the crop consultants that are working for the NC Soybean Producers Association, but I don't have a high level of familiarity with the data sets.
Would you say it is a mistake to increase your population just to combat deer pressure?
Haven't done any research in that area, but I know a lot of producers who have severe deer management challenges will often use high populations as an opportunity to mitigate that. And from our research, we really don't tend to see yield drag from really high populations until you get to like 200, 220, 250, like really high populations. So I don't know that you're going to have necessarily a negative impact, except maybe economically, from using really high seeding rates, unless you get like really high. Okay, appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all today.